Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the heart of ancient Babylonians, the land of ziggurats, clay tablets, and bread that was, frankly, more brick-like than brioche. You step into the dusty streets just as the first pale wash of dawn brushes the sky. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and warm grain. The night's chill still clings to the walls, but the city is already stirring. Temple bells ring somewhere far off, low and steady, like the city's heartbeat reminding you that morning doesn't wait for sleepyheads. You probably wouldn't survive this schedule. By the way, Babylonian bakers are up before even the most dedicated modern baristas. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from, so drop your city and local time down in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge down a narrow lane, your sandals scuffing against the dusty ground. There's a faint glow ahead, an early bakery, already at full steam. Well, not steam exactly. These bakers are working with domed clay ovens, heated by wood and charcoal, and the air near the shop is a mix of warm smoke and the earthy scent of dough. You catch yourself thinking how oddly comforting that aroma is, even if the bread here is shaped like fat discs that could double as doorstops. The head baker, a wiry man with skin darkened by years of standing next to fiery ovens, gives you a nod that says, "You're late, stranger." He's been up for hours, stoking the embers, while everyone else was still drooling into their mats. The oven is shaped like a small beehive, glowing from within. You notice the baker's hands scarred from the heat, coated with flour, and you get a sense that this job is both an art and a marathon. Historians still argue whether ancient Babylonian bakers followed a strict recipe or if they just winged it each morning. Judging by the baker's squint as he tests the heat with a sprinkle of flour watching it char instantly, you suspect winging it was a valid strategy. A quirky tidbit: some bakers used to throw a pinch of ashes onto the oven floor. If it turned white too quickly, the heat was right. If not, it was back to fanning the flames like an over-caffeinated blacksmith. As you lean against the wall, another scent hits your nose beer. Not the cold, bubbly stuff you might crave after a long day, but a thick, sour beer used for both drinking and, oddly enough, baking. In Babylon, beer was practically a food group. You can imagine the baker scooping some of that fermented barley sludge into his dough, muttering that it gives a better rise. You're not sure whether to be impressed or horrified. The street begins to stir. A woman carrying a basket of dates wanders past, pausing to call out a friendly insult about the baker's last batch being harder than the city walls. He grins, waving her off, and you catch a warm, communal vibe here. Baking isn't just about food, it's a performance, a conversation with neighbors, gods, and the relentless Babylonian sun. The bells in the temple grow louder now, as if reminding everyone that the day is officially underway. You take a moment to notice the texture of the city around you, the mud brick houses, the narrow alleys, the faint chatter of merchants setting up early stalls. It's a world that feels distant and immediate all at once. The baker beckons you closer. He slaps a lump of dough onto a wooden paddle and gestures toward the oven. The heat radiates against your face, so intense that you step back instinctively. He laughs softly, a sound like gravel rolling down a slope. You realize this is more than baking. It's a dance with fire, a balance of intuition and routine. Somewhere in the background, a dog barks. Someone's rooster is having a nervous breakdown about the new day. You feel your modern brain start to slow down, lulled by the simple rhythm: knead, shape, bake, repeat. There's something deeply soothing about watching people make bread the same way they have for thousands of years, without timers, without fancy mixers, just raw skill and patience. By the time the first loaf emerges, slightly scorched on the edges, the street is alive with curious noses sniffing the air. You take a bite. It's chewy, earthy, and vaguely sweet from the barley beer. It's not artisan sourdough, but it's survival bread, and for a moment you feel like a true Babylonian baker's apprentice. You stay near the warm glow of the bakery, hypnotized by the quiet rhythm of the morning. The baker, clearly proud of his glowing clay ovens, motions for you to take a closer look. These aren't just any ovens, they're tanners, rounded clay domes with a narrow opening at the top, almost like small volcanoes ready to erupt with heat. The inside walls are darkened with years of fire and flour, telling silent stories of countless loaves baked in their bellies. You run your fingers along the rough exterior, feeling its warmth seep into your skin, and you can't help but imagine the countless bakers before you doing exactly the same thing. The baker grabs a thin paddle, carved from date palm wood, and slides a flat disc of dough onto the oven's inner wall. It sticks there like magic well, like a mix of steam and careful technique, and you realize the bread is baked vertically, clinging to the hot clay. No trays, no parchment, no trendy non-stick pans. Just dough, fire, and gravity, and somehow it works. He grins, tapping the outside of the oven. You see a faint pattern of white ashes near the bottom, almost like markings on a chalkboard. This, he says with a wag of his flour-covered finger, is how you know the heat is right. You watch as he sprinkles a pinch of ashes into the fire. If the ashes rise up with a quick hiss and turn pale within seconds, the oven is ready. If not, it's back to adjusting the flame-setting twigs, fanning the embers with a reed mat, and muttering things that sound halfway between curses and prayers. Historians still argue whether Babylonian bakers were the first to perfect this ash trick or if they borrowed it from neighboring Sumerians. There's no official patent here, of course, just dusty clay tablets scribbled with notes that might be recipes or, for all you know, someone's shopping list. The quirkiness of it all makes you smile. You catch a glimpse of a tiny detail. The oven's floor is layered with crushed river reeds, their charred remains forming a natural insulation. It's a small but clever hack, preventing the bread from burning too fast while giving it that earthy aroma. You're tempted to ask if modern pizza ovens are just a fancier version of these ancient contraptions, but the baker is too busy slapping another loaf onto the oven wall to hear your brilliant observation. A young apprentice, barely taller than the paddle he's holding, rushes over with a bundle of firewood. His tunic is smeared with ash, and his wide eyes suggest he'd rather be anywhere else, maybe fishing or chasing goats, but this is his reality. He adds sticks to the fire with a look of mild terror, as if the oven might swallow him whole. You give him a reassuring nod, though you're secretly impressed by how brave he is to stand this close to the roaring heat. The baker points to a small clay bowl nearby, its rim blackened from soot. It's filled with water and sits next to the oven's base. At first you assume it's for drinking. But nothis is the baker's secret weapon. He dips his fingers in and flicks droplets onto the oven wall. The sizzling sound tells him whether the temperature is just right, too loud and sharp, too hot. Barely a hiss, not hot enough. It's an ancient version of your digital oven thermometer, but far more poetic. You lean back, feeling the waves of heat ripple across your face, and wonder how many generations have stood here, judging fire by sight, touch, and sound. It's a slow art, yet deeply satisfying. There's no set it and forget it button. You have to be present, listening to the language of flames and dough. A random dog ambles into the bakery, wagging its tail and sniffing hopefully for crumbs. The baker pretends not to see it, though you catch him tossing a scrap of burnt bread when he thinks no one's looking. You chuckle softly, realizing this small kindness has probably been repeated in every bakery since the dawn of time. As the loaves begin to puff against the oven wall, you notice the crust forming a rich golden-brown hue that glows in the firelight. It's mesmerizing, almost like watching the sun rise in miniature. The baker uses a hooked reed stick to peel off one loaf, spinning it like a small clay discus before placing it on a wooden board. The aroma hits you instantly, warm, nutty, and slightly smoky. You can't help but break off a piece. The inside is soft and steaming, the outside firm but not too hard. It's a taste of survival, simplicity, and centuries-old tradition. You imagine how many of these loaves have fed kings, soldiers, and children alike. And for a brief moment, you're part of that unbroken line of humanity, sharing a bite with people long gone but never forgotten. The warmth of the oven fades slightly as you step outside, letting the cool morning breeze brush your face. The bakery's interior smells like smoke and grain, but here, under the open sky of Babylon, you catch the faint sweetness of blooming date palms. The city is waking, slowly but surely, and so are its many ways of keeping time. Forget wristwatches and smartphone alarms out here. You have nothing but shadows, sun, and a well-honed sense of maybe the bread is ready, maybe it's charcoal now. You wander to a small courtyard near the temple walls, where an elderly man squints at a tall, narrow pillar marked with etched lines. It's a rudimentary sundial, though calling it high-tech would be pushing it. The old man adjusts his stance, muttering about the angle of the sun, while his apprentice jots notes on a clay tablet. You watch the thin shadow inching along, and the realization dawns. This is the timer. When the shadow crosses a certain line, it's time to check the bread or risk, explaining to someone why the king's breakfast looks like burnt roof tiles. Historians still argue whether these early sundials were accurate enough for baking or just ceremonial, but you suspect they were good enough. After all, who's going to complain when you can't exactly preheat the sun? The whole system feels charmingly casual, more a dance with nature than the rigid ticking of modern clocks. A quirky tidbit catches your attention. The baker you met earlier has a habit of holding up his hand to the sun, judging the time by how many finger widths separate the sun from the horizon. It's like an ancient game of shadow puppets mixed with culinary science. He laughs when he sees you copying him, saying, "One handbreadth means you'd better flip the bread." You're not sure if he's serious, but it sounds plausible enough to trust. Nearby, children chase each other through the streets, their laughter mixing with the calls of merchants preparing for the day. A woman balances a clay jug on her head while humming a tune that, somehow, matches the rhythm of the sundial's silent march. You realize time here isn't measured in seconds or minutes, it's measured in tasks, routines, and the natural flow of light. The courtyard is alive with textures, the rough surface of mud brick walls, the cool smoothness of clay jars, the dusty patterns left by sandals shuffling through the sand. You imagine standing here every morning, gauging the perfect moment to retrieve bread, not because of a timer, but because your instincts tell you the crust has reached that golden balance between crisp and tender. You notice another curious tool resting against the temple steps, a long reed stick with markings burned into its surface. The apprentice explains, in halting gestures, that it's used to measure shadow lengths during different parts of the day. Short shadows mean high heat, long shadows mean the cooler afternoon. It's simple, but you can see how bakers learn to synchronize their work with the heavens above. You find yourself staring at the horizon. The sun climbs steadily, casting golden light that glints off the city's ziggurat, its step sides rising like a giant wedding cake. The shadow of the ziggurat itself stretches across the city, a silent timekeeper visible to everyone. The baker, his arms folded, nods toward it and says, "When the shadow touches the market gate, bread must be done." You can almost hear the timer beep in your modern brain. A wandering scholar approaches, muttering about whether Babylonians were the first to connect astronomy with daily chores like baking. Or maybe the Egyptians did it first, he grumbles, shaking his head. You smile, realizing some debates never change. Historians, past and present, still love arguing about who invented what. As the morning heats up, you return to the bakery. The sunlight spilling through the open doorway feels like a clock striking an invisible hour. You catch the baker pulling a loaf from the oven, his timing impeccable as always. It's clear that while modern kitchens rely on timers and alarms, here it's all about reading the signs, the sky, the fire, and even the scent of the bread itself. One last look at the sundial convinces you that this isn't just about telling time, it's about being present. You feel oddly calm, almost hypnotized by the slow crawl of the shadow. In a world where everything moves at lightning speed, the Babylonians remind you that waiting for bread can be its own kind of meditation. Back inside the bakery, you notice a strange dripping sound, like water trickling down a crack in the wall. It's coming from a clay bowl, suspended slightly above the ground by a set of wooden pegs. Water drips steadily from a small hole in its base into another container below. The baker sees you staring and grins, wiping flour on his tunic. "Our water clock," he says, tapping the upper bowl. When the bowl is half empty, the bread is halfway done, or at least, that's the theory. This is your introduction to the clepsydra, one of the oldest time-measuring devices known to mankind. The Babylonians didn't invent it. Egyptians probably had the idea first, but they embraced it with the enthusiasm of someone who just discovered how not to burn their dinner. The trick is simple. Water flows at a constant rate, and by marking how long it takes to fill or empty a vessel, you get a rough sense of time. Of course, rough is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. If the day is humid or the hole is clogged, your timer suddenly goes rogue, and congratulations, your bread is either undercooked dough or a crunchy discus. Historians still argue whether these water clocks were ever accurate enough for culinary tasks, or if they were mainly used for temple ceremonies and astronomical calculations. But the baker insists this one works just fine. He gestures to an apprentice to refill the upper bowl. then gives you a wink as if to say, "Don't worry, it's better than nothing." You crouch down to watch the slow drip. The sound is soothing, almost hypnotic, like a metronome that makes your eyelids heavy. Drip, drip, drip. You start to imagine each drop as a heartbeat of the city, a reminder that Babylon's life is measured not in seconds, but in moments like these, moments of waiting, watching, and breathing in the aroma of rising bread. Nearby, a quarrel breaks out among two merchants arguing over whose water clock is more trustworthy. One claims his bowl is carved from river clay and calibrated by a priest who knows the stars. The other says, "That's nonsense," and waves a half-burnt loaf of bread as proof that the first man's timing is a cosmic joke. The baker chuckles, clearly entertained by their antics. You can't help but laugh too, thinking how some things never change, whether it's high-tech kitchen gadgets or ancient dripping bowls. Everyone swears theirs is the best. The baker invites you to try the water clock yourself. You place your hand beneath the drip, counting each drop as it splashes onto your skin. The water is cool, almost startlingly so compared to the oven's heat. It's like a tiny contrast between the elements, fire and water, working together to ensure you don't end up with a lump of charred regret. A quirky detail catches your eye. Etched into the side of the clay bowl are faint markings, probably added over years of trial and error. You see small symbols, maybe stars, maybe numbers, that hint at a primitive system of measurement. It's surprisingly modern in its intent, even if the execution would make a modern baker roll their eyes. As the upper bowl drains, the baker flips a loaf with a swift, practiced motion. The timing is eerie, almost like he's listening to the water's rhythm instead of looking at the bread. You wonder if he's counting drips in his head, or if this is just intuition sharpened by decades of waking up at ridiculous hours. The apprentice, clearly curious about your fascination, picks up a stick and scratches something on the dirt floor, a rough sketch of the water clock. He looks at you with wide eyes, as if sharing a great secret. You nod solemnly, playing along because honestly you're impressed that this kid who can barely keep his tunic clean understands timekeeping better than you do without a watch. The drip slows, signaling that the timer is nearly done. The baker checks the oven, pulls out another loaf and nods with satisfaction. "See?" he says. "It works most days." You glance at the bread, perfectly browned, and can't argue. Still, you can't help but think how stressful this must have been during a festival when the king demanded flawless bread at dawn. One bad drip, and it's probably a week in the dungeon. The baker shrugs, as if reading your thoughts. "When in doubt," he says with a grin, "I just taste it." You watch as he breaks off a piece of steaming bread, blows on it, and pops it in his mouth without hesitation. "That," he adds, "is the oldest timer in the world, your tongue." The bakery is a lively rhythm of heat, smoke, and murmured instructions, but your attention shifts to the wooden table in the center of the room. Here, the true alchemy of bread begins, kneading the dough. The baker plops down a heavy mass of flour and water with a soft thud that sounds almost like a drumbeat announcing breakfast. You lean in, mesmerized by the way his fingers dig, fold, and stretch the dough, turning it from a messy paste into something smooth and elastic. "Watch carefully," he says, his voice low, like he's sharing an ancient secret. "This isn't just mixing flour and water, it's coaxing life out of grain." He sprinkles a handful of crushed barley malt into the mix, explaining that it helps with fermentation and adds a hint of sweetness. You're tempted to ask about yeast packets or sourdough starters, but the baker is already laughing. "Yeast? Our yeast is the wild spirit in the air. It's been floating around these streets since Hammurabi was a toddler." Historians still argue whether the Babylonians intentionally cultivated wild yeast or if every loaf was a surprise science experiment. Whatever the truth, the baker's confidence suggests they knew more than they let on. You watch as he works the dough with strong, deliberate motions, pausing only to dust the surface with flour when it sticks. His hands are quick but gentle, almost affectionate, as though the dough is an old friend that just needs a little convincing to cooperate. Beside him, a young apprentice tries to mimic his movements, but the dough flops stubbornly, sticking to his forearms like an ancient Babylonian prank. The baker sighs and shakes his head. "You have to feel it," he says, guiding the boy's hands. "It's not about strength. It's about rhythm." You can't help but smile at the sight, because it's oddly comforting to see that even 4,000 years ago, Apprentices were making the same clumsy mistakes as modern baking students. A quirky tidbit you overhear. Some bakers believed that whispering prayers or chants into the dough helped it rise better. As if to prove the point, the baker starts humming a low tune, a mix of melody and ritual while folding the dough. The apprentice, not wanting to be left out, hums too, but off-key enough to make you stifle a laugh. It's unclear whether the dough appreciates the serenade, but the atmosphere becomes strangely serene. You notice a stack of clay jars on a nearby shelf, each filled with ingredients. There's coarse ground wheat, a pale powdery flour made from emmer grain, and a sticky jar of honey that glistens under the morning light. The baker dips his finger into the honey and lets a single drop fall onto the dough. For luck, he says, grinning, and for flavor. Even the gods like sweet bread. Speaking of gods, you glance toward the temple down the street. There's a faint sound of chanting, probably priests preparing morning offerings. The baker pauses, almost reverently, before continuing. It's clear that baking here isn't just about feeding people, it's a ritual, a sacred act that links the ordinary with the divine. Every loaf, every grain, carries a whisper of prayer. The baker motions for you to try kneading. At first, the dough clings to your fingers like an overenthusiastic puppy. You fumble, your hands awkwardly pushing and folding, and the baker chuckles. "Don't fight it," he says. "Just let it flow." Slowly, you find the rhythm press with the heel of your hand, fold, turn, and press again. It's oddly satisfying, like a workout for both body and mind. You can almost feel the texture transforming under your touch, going from sticky chaos to smooth potential. The apprentice suddenly pipes up with gossip apparently. There's talk of a neighboring baker who claims to have invented a secret blend of flour and sesame seeds that keeps bread soft longer. The head baker rolls his eyes. "Every baker has a secret blend," he mutters. "Usually it's just whatever they had left in the grain bin." You chuckle, realizing that bragging about artisan methods is not just a modern trend. As the dough rests, covered with a cloth to rise, you lean back and feel an odd sense of calm. Watching this ancient craft unfold is like stepping out of time. There's no rush, no ticking clock, just the slow magic of flour, water, and patience. The baker pats the resting dough like you'd pat a loyal dog, then gives you a knowing nod. "Good bread," he says softly, "teaches you to wait." By mid-morning, the bakery begins to buzz with energy. Traders from the marketplace stop by, their arms laden with goods, each hoping to strike a deal with the bakers. You hear the jingle of bronze coins, the rustle of woven baskets, and the low hum of bargaining voices echoing through the narrow streets. It's here that you witness the true variety of exotic ingredients arriving in Babylon, treasures brought by caravans crossing deserts and rivers. One merchant sets down a basket brimming with dates, their glossy skins catching the sunlight like tiny jewels. Another carries pots of honey, thick and golden, sloshing slightly as he moves. The baker eyes these ingredients with the same curiosity you might reserve for a new kitchen gadget. He picks up a date, splits it open with his thumb, and nods approvingly before tossing it into a clay bowl. "Sweet bread," he mutters with a grin, "for the gods, and maybe for the people, if they behave." You watch as he stirs chopped dates into the dough, their natural sugars promising a rich, caramel-like sweetness once baked. It's easy to see why such loaves would be considered a luxury. Historians still argue whether Babylonian sweetbreads were a rare indulgence or a common treat during festivals. Some evidence suggests that these enriched loaves were reserved for temple offerings or special occasions like royal banquets. You imagine the king biting into a warm honey-drizzled loaf while servants fan him with palm leaves, and you can't help but wonder if you'd trade your entire modern pantry just for one bite. A quirky tidbit emerges as the baker reaches for a small jar of sesame seeds. He sprinkles them liberally over the dough, explaining that sesame was believed to bring good luck and health. Some even whispered that sesame seeds were favored by the gods themselves. You joke silently that maybe open sesame was less about magic doors and more about getting first dibs on bread. A group of children gathers near the bakery window, peering in with wide eyes as the baker experiments with a batch of honey date rolls. Their faces light up when he tosses a few scraps their way. You can't help but smile at the scene, realizing that the simple joy of warm bread is timeless. Nearby, a spice trader tries to tempt the baker with a pouch of ground cardamom and cinnamon, rare and pricey imports from distant lands. "A pinch of this," the trader says with a sly grin, will make your bread smell like heaven. The baker snorts but takes a whiff, his eyes narrowing as the scent hits him. He doesn't commit, but you know he's tempted. The marketplace itself is alive, with textures and colors. You step outside for a moment, wandering among stalls shaded by linen cloths. There are baskets of dried figs, heaps of fragrant herbs, and jars of pungent fish paste, which you secretly hope won't find its way into any bread recipe. You hear two merchants bickering about whether last year's honey harvest was better than this year's, their voices rising in a chorus of dramatic claims. The baker returns with a small sack, slung over his shoulder. "Ground chickpeas," he says proudly. "We mix it with flour for a lighter loaf." You raise an eyebrow, thinking that even modern gluten-free enthusiasts might learn a thing or two from this ancient innovation. As he works the new ingredients into the dough, you notice how the colors change. A swirl of golden honey, the rich brown of dates, the pale dusting of sesame. The scent in the bakery shifts from smoky grain to a warm, sweet aroma that makes your stomach growl audibly. The apprentice giggles, handing you a small ball of dough to taste once baked. By now, the baker has formed small rolls, tucking a date in the center of each, like a hidden surprise. He sets them carefully on a flat board and slides them into the oven, his movements slow and deliberate. "Patience," he says softly, "is the spice no merchant can sell." You lean against the wall, feeling the heat on your face, and realize he's absolutely right. The first sweet roll emerges moments later, glistening with a light coating of honey. You break it open, the steam escapes in a lazy curl, and the scent of caramelized fruit fills the air. You take a bite, and for a moment, it's as if time itself pauses. The scent of freshly baked honey date rolls trails you as you step into the heart of the bustling marketplace. The air here feels alive thick, with the aroma of roasted meats, clay pots, simmering with lentils, and of course, that unmistakable, smoky sweet perfume of bread. You weave through narrow aisles between stalls, where merchants shout prices with the kind of dramatic flair usually reserved for street performers. One man waves a handful of onions in the air like a trophy, while another boasts that his sesame oil could make even the gods lick their lips. You pause near a stall stacked with flatbreads, watching as a young woman trades a handful of barley grain for a loaf wrapped in a strip of woven palm leaf. The exchange is quick but friendly, punctuated by gossip about the temple priests and their strict demands for bread quality. "Did you hear?" the woman whispers to the vendor, leaning in conspiratorially. "The palace baker burned 3 loaves yesterday, 3. The king nearly sent him to wash camel hooves as punishment." The vendor laughs, shaking his head, and you can't help but grin at the thought of a royal bread scandal. Historians still argue whether markets like this were run by state officials or private traders, but the mood here suggests a mix of both, part public necessity, part social hangout. It's less about cold, efficient transactions and more about the chatter that comes with them. You linger, ears tuned to the conversations, like you're eavesdropping on a giant group text from 1800 BCE. A quirky tidbit catches your attention. One of the merchants claims that the secret to perfectly timed bread is to bake it while reciting the number of steps it takes to walk from the city gate to the ziggurat. 163 steps, he declares proudly. "And that's how long my flatbread needs." You're not entirely convinced this is a foolproof method, but you admire his confidence. As you stroll further, you spot the baker from earlier, now standing at a stall of his own. He's surrounded by curious customers sniffing his honey date rolls and nodding appreciatively. He greets you with a wink, pressing a small roll into your hand as if to say, "This is better than any marketplace gossip." Nearby, a group of older women are deep in discussion about which baker is the most reliable during festival season. "That one over there," one says, pointing to a man in a red tunic, "always burns the bottoms." The second woman shakes her head. "I'd rather chew on brick than eat his bread." Their conversation is so animated that even the apprentice, usually shy and quiet, starts giggling. You pass a stall selling spices and dried herbs. The vendor waves a bundle of dried coriander under your nose, insisting that it's the key to divine flavor. He points to a neighboring stall where a rival spice trader scoffs and mutters something about coriander being overrated. It's clear that spice rivalries here are as intense as the battle between coffee brands in your local supermarket. The sun climbs higher, and you notice how people's movements start to shift. Merchants glance toward the shadows of the tall walls, adjusting their tasks as if the length of a shadow is as trustworthy as any clock. The baker nods toward the marketplace gate, where a deep, sharp line of shade cuts across the stone floor. That, he says, is my reminder to check the next batch. You follow him back to the bakery, your hands still sticky from the sweet roll. As you walk, children run past carrying tiny bundles of bread, laughing and teasing each other with crumbs. The street feels like an endless thread of stories, every loaf exchanged, every coin spent, weaving a narrative that spans centuries. Back inside, the baker sets his basket of marketplace goods on the table. You know, he says with a grin, the bread isn't the only thing that needs timing. So does the gossip. If you arrive too early, there's nothing to hear. Too late, and you miss the best stories. You laugh, thinking how true that is, even now. The next batch of dough is ready, speckled with sesame seeds and dotted with the dates you saw earlier. He shapes the loaves with quick, confident movements, as though every piece carries not just ingredients but tales from the marketplace itself. The sun is now a blazing disk above the rooftops, and you squint as you step outside again. The baker follows you, carrying a tray of freshly shaped loaves. This, he says, tilting his head toward the sun, is the only timer we truly trust. You look up, the sunlight almost blinding, and realize he means it literally. The angle, brightness, and color of the sun dictate everything here: when to knead, when to bake, and when to grab a well-deserved sip of beer. He places the tray on a wooden bench, the dough glistening with a sheen of honey. We don't watch clocks, he says, we watch shadows. He points to the ground where the bakery's wall casts a sharp line. When the shadow of the doorframe touches the edge of this bench, we know it's time to check the bread. You nod, slightly awed by how effortlessly nature becomes a kitchen tool. Historians still argue whether Babylonians learned this sun-based timing from earlier Sumerian farmers or developed it independently. The truth may never be clear, but standing here, you can see how intuitive it is. The sun is the same one that's been rising for millennia, and it hasn't failed them yet. A quirky scene unfolds as a group of children begins playing a game with the shadows. They hop over the dark lines, chanting silly rhymes that sound vaguely like, "Don't burn the bread." One little boy, no more than 5 years old, pretends to be a baker, mimicking the motion of flipping imaginary loaves in an invisible oven. The sight makes you smile. It's as though even their play is woven into the rhythms of bread and time. Back in the bakery, the baker crouches to check the oven's glow. He adjusts the firewood, eyes flicking from the flames to the sunlight streaming through the doorway. "When the sun tells me, I'll turn them," he murmurs, half to himself. You watch as he taps the oven wall with a reed stick, another check on the heat. You get the sense that his timing is less about rules and more about instinct, shaped by years of watching light and shadow shift. You decide to step outside again and notice how the entire street seems to move in sync with the sun. Merchants adjust their awnings, women rearrange baskets to avoid direct sunlight on perishable goods, and even the stray cats seem to retreat into the shade as the day grows hotter. It's as if the city itself is a giant sundial, with everyone reading the same silent clock. The baker joins you, shading his eyes. "See that?" he asks, pointing to the long shadow cast by the temple spire. "When it reaches the market gate, our bread will be ready." You can't help but marvel at the simplicity of it all. No alarms, no timers, just careful observation and trust in the natural rhythm of the day. You remember a funny story one of the merchants told earlier about a young apprentice who once fell asleep and misjudged the sun's position. The result was a tray of loaves so burnt they were sold as building material for cheap walls. Everyone in the marketplace still teases him about it, calling him Brick Baker. You chuckle, imagining that poor kid trying to explain himself to an annoyed customer. The baker returns inside, motioning for you to follow. He slides the loaves onto a wooden paddle and flips them with a swift motion that's almost theatrical. "Timing," he says with a sly smile, "isn't about counting. It's about listening to the fire, the smell, even the feel of the air." You watch as he lifts one loaf to his ear, giving it a light tap. Hollow sound, he says, means it's done. The scent that fills the bakery is heavenly. You lean in as he slices open one of the loaves, revealing a soft, steaming interior flecked with bits of caramelized date. You take a piece, and it practically melts on your tongue, sweet, warm, and slightly smoky. It's amazing how something so ancient can taste so fresh. The apprentice, eager to impress, points outside and says, "The shadow has moved. We need to start the next batch." The baker grins, ruffles the boy's hair, and mutters, "Good eye. Maybe you'll be more than a brick baker after all." The bakery quiets for a moment, the only sounds being the crackle of firewood and the soft sigh of dough rising under linen cloths. You notice a pair of young apprentices bustling around like overworked honeybees. One boy, barely taller than the oven itself, holds a clay jug of water with both hands, his face scrunched in determination. The other sweeps the ash-streaked floor with a handmade broom that looks more like a bundle of reeds tied together in a hurry. The head baker watches them with a raised eyebrow, clearly amused by their clumsy enthusiasm. "They're learning," he says in a tone that's equal parts pride and exasperation. "Bread teaches patience if it doesn't break your back first." You see what he means as the younger boy nearly trips over his own feet, spilling a few drops of water onto the floor. The apprentice flinches, but the baker just chuckles and shoos him back to work. Historians still argue whether apprentices in ancient Babylon were treated kindly or pushed through grueling routines. Some records suggest long hours of labor with little reward, while others describe the bakery as a communal training ground where skills were passed down like sacred knowledge. Watching these kids, you'd believe both. They look tired, but there's also a gleam of curiosity in their eyes, a spark that says they want to master the craft. A quirky moment breaks the routine when one of the apprentices sneaks a tiny piece of warm bread from the cooling rack. He blows on it quickly, hiding it behind his back as if the bread might scream, "Thief!" Any second, you catch him mid-bite, and he flashes you a guilty grin. The baker pretends not to see, though the corners of his mouth twitch like he's fighting a laugh. You imagine that little stolen bite might be the most satisfying snack in all of Babylon. The older apprentice, determined to prove his worth, takes charge of preparing the next batch of dough. His hands are smaller, but he mimics the head baker's every motion: press, fold, turn, repeat. You watch as he leans into the table, his brows furrowed in concentration. He glances up at you, maybe hoping you'll notice his effort, and you give him a nod of encouragement. There's a faint rhythm to their work, almost musical. The sound of the broom sweeping, the thud of kneaded dough, and the occasional splash of water create a background beat that feels oddly soothing. You could almost fall asleep standing there, lulled by the repetitive movements. Suddenly, the younger apprentice shouts, "Too much firewood." The flames inside the oven have surged, licking dangerously high. The head baker moves fast, tossing a handful of damp ash onto the fire to calm it. He mutters something about not burning the king's lunch, and you can't help but grin at the image of a royal complaint about overcooked flatbread. To lighten the mood, the baker calls the apprentices over and begins shaping the dough into funny, lopsided shapes. Looks like a crooked fish, another like a bird with stubby wings. The kids laugh, trying to copy his creations but ending up with blobs that vaguely resemble potatoes. You realize this is part of their education too, learning that baking isn't just precision, but playfulness. As the day stretches on, the apprentices take turns fanning the oven with woven mats to keep the temperature just right. They move in a clumsy but earnest dance, their small arms flapping like determined birds. You catch the baker watching them with a soft, almost paternal look. Maybe he remembers his own years as a clumsy apprentice, dropping dough and earning nicknames like half-burn. The older boy finally delivers a loaf that's almost perfect golden crust, puffed just right. The baker nods approvingly and hands the boy a warm roll as a silent reward. The younger one pouts, but quickly earns his own when he successfully carries water without spilling it everywhere. Watching these small victories, you feel oddly invested, like you're cheering for characters in a very slow, bread-centered sports movie. By the time the apprentices take a break, their faces are streaked with ash and flour, their hair sticking out in wild tufts. They sit on the floor, sharing a piece of bread between them, talking about who will one day become the master of ovens. You smile, thinking that every craft, no matter how old, has its legends and future dreamers. As the morning rolls into midday, a solemn atmosphere takes hold of the bakery. The apprentices clear the table, brushing off the last traces of flour, while the head baker carefully selects the finest dough balls from the resting cloths. "These," he says, his voice dropping to a reverent hush, "are for the temple." You immediately sense the shift. This isn't just baking, it's a sacred ritual meant for the gods themselves. The baker lifts a polished wooden tray and arranges the dough discs like treasures. Each piece is shaped with unusual care, flattened and smoothed so that not a single crack or uneven edge remains. The gods, he murmurs, do not eat, but they appreciate beauty. You almost laugh at the thought of divine beings judging crust aesthetics, but you wisely keep quiet. Historians still argue whether temple bread offerings were purely symbolic or if they were later shared among priests and attendees. What's certain is that bread was considered an essential part of Babylonian religious ceremonies. Some records even suggest that specific loaves were baked with oils, honey, or special inscriptions pressed into the dough, serving as edible prayers. The baker dips a carved stamp into a thin coat of sesame oil and presses it gently onto each loaf. When he lifts it, you see symbolstony wedges and lines, like cuneiform writing imprinted on the surface. Names of gods, he explains. Sometimes wishes. A healthy harvest, strong rains, peace in the city. It's like the world's oldest version of fortune cookies, except these are much heavier and don't come with lucky numbers. A quirky tidbit reaches your ears from the apprentice, who whispers that once a priest scolded a baker for presenting a slightly lopsided offering. The god Marduk, the priest declared, deserves bread shaped like the morning sun. Since then, the baker has been obsessed with perfect circles, even using a thin clay ring as a guide. You watch him trace the outline with absolute precision, as if the entire fate of Babylon depends on a flawless loaf. As he places the sacred bread into the oven, a hush falls over the bakery. Even the apprentices stop their usual chatter. The firelight flickers across their faces, and for a moment, you could swear the oven itself feels like a small altar. There's a strange beauty in watching fire transform these simple ingredients into something worthy of the gods. When the loaves emerge, the baker inspects each one like a jeweler examining gemstones. He sets them on a tray lined with a clean cloth, nodding with satisfaction. These will go to the temple, he says, handing the tray to the older apprentice. The boy straightens his back, clearly aware of the honor this task holds. You follow them to the temple gates, where priests dressed in flowing robes are already waiting. The high priest, tall and stern, gives the bread a quick glance and offers a curt nod. Good work, he says to the boy, who beams like he's just passed a royal exam. The temple itself looms high above you, its walls etched with carvings of gods, celestial symbols, and endless rows of cuneiform. You catch a glimpse of the altar inside, covered with offerings, fruits, wine, and now, the gleaming bread loaves you helped prepare. A gentle breeze sweeps through the courtyard, carrying the mingled scents of incense and warm dough. One priest approaches the baker and murmurs something about an upcoming festival. The baker's eyebrows rise, and you hear him mutter, "More bread than 10 ovens can hold." You can tell he's already mentally calculating how many sacks of grain he'll need. On your way back, the apprentices chatter excitedly about the temple rituals, their faces glowing with a mix of awe and pride. The younger one insists he saw a god's shadow move across the altar, but the older one just laughs. You smile, letting their playful argument wash over you, as the baker shakes his head like a man who's seen 100 such stories spun from imagination. By early afternoon, the bakery transforms into a whirlwind of activity. Word has spread that a royal festival is approaching, and suddenly the demand for bread multiplies tenfold. The head baker mutters something about feeding half of Babylon, while his apprentices exchange wide-eyed looks of both fear and excitement. The table is cleared again, flour scattered like snow across its surface, and the mixing begins anew. Festival bread, the baker declares, slamming a bowl of water down with a splash. Bigger, richer, and it must look like it's fit for a king. You notice that the ingredients are slightly different this time: more honey, more sesame, and a generous handful of chopped nuts from a merchant's basket. The dough glistens under the sunlight filtering through the window, promising a feast worthy of legend. Historians still argue about the exact recipes for these celebratory loaves. Some claim they were shaped into intricate patterns, like coiled snakes or rising suns, while others believe the Babylonians preferred simpler, hearty loaves that would keep festival goers full. You watch as the baker experiments with both. One loaf is meticulously braided, while another is as plain and solid as a brick. The apprentices hustle around, their faces red from the heat and effort. The younger one is tasked with fetching more firewood, and he drags in an entire bundle twice his size, panting like a small ox. The older boy fans the flames, his arms moving in a frantic rhythm to keep the ovens hot enough to handle batch after batch. "Don't let the fire die," the baker warns, "or we'll be here all night." A quirky tidbit surfaces when one of the market women stops by to drop off a special ingredient, dried rose petals. "For fragrance," she says with a smile. The baker, though skeptical, sprinkles a few into the dough and laughs. Let's see if the king likes flowers with his bread. You wonder if this is the ancient equivalent of putting lavender in lattice, part fancy experiment, part marketing stunt. The bakery becomes an assembly line. You find yourself pressing dates into the tops of loaves, while the apprentices scurry between ovens like tiny soldiers. The heat is intense now, waves of it rolling off the clay ovens and wrapping around you like a heavy blanket. Sweat drips down your forehead, and you start to understand why the baker always keeps a jug of beer close by. It's not just for flavor, it's for survival. Outside, the street is alive with festival preparations. Colorful banners flutter from wooden poles, musicians tune their lyres, and the sound of drums pulses faintly in the distance. Children chase each other with streamers, their laughter mingling with the clatter of merchants setting up stalls for the big day. You feel a rising excitement, like the whole city is holding its breath for something grand. Back inside, the head baker shouts, "Next batch, hurry!" The apprentices move faster, rolling dough with the speed of seasoned craftsmen. You can't help but laugh when the younger one accidentally flings a small dough ball across the room. It lands with a soft splat against the wall, leaving a mark that might still be there 3,000 years later. The baker sighs but grins, shaking his head. As the first festival loaves emerge from the oven, the scent is almost intoxicating. Honey caramelizes on the crust, sesame seeds crackle, and the faint floral note of rose drifts through the air. The baker slices one loaf open, handing you a piece. It's soft, sweet, and warm, with a texture that feels almost luxurious compared to the simpler morning bread. You close your eyes for a moment, savoring the taste, and think, yes, this is bread for celebrations. The apprentices cheer when the baker declares the first batch perfect. More loaves follow, each one carefully packed into woven baskets lined with cloth. Soon, the bakery looks like a treasure trove of golden bread, stacked high and ready for the feast. The bakery feels like it's vibrating with energy. Yet amidst all this festival madness, you overhear a conversation that makes you pause. One of the apprentices whispers about the superstitions surrounding bread baking. "You have to be careful," he says with wide eyes, "or the spirits in the oven will play tricks on you." The older apprentice rolls his eyes, but the boy continues, insisting that a crooked loaf is a sign that some mischievous spirit nudged it in the wrong direction. The head baker laughs when he hears this. "Spirits? The only spirit in that oven is the fire you forgot to feed." Still, as he wipes sweat from his brow, you notice him glancing at the oven with a touch of respect, as though part of him isn't entirely sure. Ancient ovens have a way of feeling alive, their heat and hiss almost breathing in rhythm with the people tending them. Historians still argue whether such superstitions were widespread among Babylonian bakers or if they were simply harmless tales told to keep apprentices alert. Some records suggest that certain rituals were performed before starting the day's baking, like tapping the oven 3 times for good luck or whispering a prayer to the kitchen goddess. The baker himself admits he sometimes mutters a few words before lighting the fire. "Just in case," he says with a smirk, "because you don't want to risk angering a god over burnt bread." A quirky tidbit emerges when the apprentice tells you about a time a loaf fell into the ash pit and came out with what looked like strange symbols scorched onto its crust. The boy swears it was a divine message, something about rain or a goat sacrifice. The baker shrugs and says it was probably just the way the fire licked the dough. You can't help but imagine ancient Babylonian conspiracy theorists interpreting bread crust like tea leaves. As the afternoon sun blazes, the air inside the bakery grows heavy, and the apprentices become restless. The younger one tries to whistle to pass the time, but only manages something that sounds like a distressed pigeon. The older apprentice shakes his head, muttering that such noises will scare the bread. The baker chuckles but doesn't correct them. Why spoil their fun when it keeps them focused? The superstitions aren't limited to the ovens. The baker shows you a small amulet hanging from a nail above the doorway, a simple clay charm shaped like a loaf of bread. Protection, he explains, from pests, bad luck, and anything that wants to spoil the dough. You nod, though you wonder how much protection a tiny charm can offer against an angry festival crowd if the bread is late. As the next batch bakes, you find yourself mesmerized by the way the fire dances, casting shadows across the walls. The baker watches the flames like an old friend, occasionally giving them a sharp poke with a stick. The fire tells stories, he says softly. If it pops too much, it's warning me the heat is uneven. If it hisses, it's happy. You tilt your head, half expecting the oven to start singing, but the fire remains stubbornly silent. The apprentices return to shaping dough. Each adding their own little flourish. One draws a crude sunburst with a stick, while the other presses sesame seeds into patterns. The gods, like pretty bread, the younger one says proudly, and you decide not to argue. Watching them work, you realize how much personality goes into each loaf. It's not just food, it's a canvas for both tradition and imagination. When the loaves are done, the baker inspects them with a critical eye. One has bubbled awkwardly on one side, and he sighs. This one, he declares, was cursed by a lazy apprentice. The boy protests, but the baker just laughs, handing him the loaf to eat as punishment. You take a bite of the cursed bread yourself, and honestly, it's delicious. Maybe the spirits are just really good bakers. The day begins to stretch into a glowing amber evening, but the work isn't done. In fact, as the heat of the sun fades, the bakers prepare for a night shift that feels just as alive as the morning bustle. Moonlight baking, the head baker calls it with a grin. The city sleeps, but bread waits for no one. He gestures to the apprentices, who scramble to gather more wood and adjust the ovens for a long night ahead. The streets outside quiet down, the noisy marketplace replaced by the soft shuffle of a few late-night vendors and the distant bark of a guard dog. The moon rises slowly, its pale light spilling over the rooftops, reflecting faintly on the clay tiles of the bakery. Inside, the firelight dances on the walls, blending with the silvery glow from outside. It feels as if two worlds, fire and moon, are baking side by side. Historians still argue whether Babylonians preferred night baking because of cooler temperatures, or if it was simply necessary to prepare enough bread for the morning rush. Whatever the reason, you can't deny the calm beauty of this twilight ritual. The air feels slower, the sound softer, and even the bread seems to rise at a gentler pace. A quirky tidbit catches your attention. The apprentices joke that the moonlight makes the loaves grow bigger, as if the bread drinks in the night's silver glow. The younger boy insists he once saw a loaf smile when baked under a full moon. The older apprentice rolls his eyes, but secretly glances at the sky, just in case. The baker hands you a wooden paddle and points to a batch of dough ready to go in. Your turn, he says. You hesitate, but under his watchful eye, you slide the dough onto the glowing oven wall. The heat roars against your face, and you feel your heart race. It's clumsy but successful. The dough sticks, and you let out a small sigh of relief. The apprentices clap quietly, clearly amused at your newbie pride. Outside the bakery, a breeze carries the smell of night-blooming flowers and cooling earth. You step into the doorway for a moment, watching as the moonlight turns the narrow street into a soft ribbon of pale light. There's a strange magic in this scene, bakers whispering over dough, shadows swaying on the walls, and the occasional hoot of an owl perched somewhere unseen. The head baker breaks the silence with a low chuckle. You know, he says, baking at night is when secrets get told. He leans on the table, dusted with flour, and shares a story about how he once misread the shadows and delivered bread half-baked to a temple feast. The priests were not amused, he laughs, but they pretended it was a new style offering. The apprentices, emboldened by the relaxed night atmosphere, start telling their own stories about bizarre market customers, rumors of magical loaves that never spoil, and one tale about a baker who claimed his bread could predict the weather. You find yourself laughing along, lulled by the cozy camaraderie of it all. As the loaves bake, the firelight grows softer, casting warm halos on the walls. You sit on a low bench, feeling the warmth on your back, the scent of rising bread wrapping around you like a blanket. The baker offers you a sip of warm barley, beer thick, slightly sour, but strangely comforting. It's not wine, he says, but it keeps you awake and humble. By the time the moon is high, the first batch of night bread is ready. The loaves are darker, crustier, with a faint smoky note that comes from the slow, steady fire. You tear a piece and let it melt in your mouth, thinking how perfect it would be with a drizzle of honey. The baker nods knowingly, as if reading your mind. The moon is still high when the baker starts grumbling about payday. As he wipes his hands on a flour-streaked cloth, he leans toward you with a smirk. You know what they pay us with? He asks. Beer, bread, and, if we're really lucky, a goat that doesn't kick too hard. You blink, unsure if he's joking, but the apprentices nod solemnly. That's true, the older boy says. My father once got half a goat for a month's work. You try not to laugh, but it's hard to imagine a paycheck that bleats. Historians still argue whether Babylonian bakers were compensated in actual goods or received a form of early currency like silver shekels. It's likely they got both, depending on who they worked for. Bread and beer were staples of daily life, and being paid with them wasn't considered an insult, it was survival. The baker, however, clearly prefers a little variety. A loaf for a day's work is fine, he mutters, but would it kill them to throw in a fig or two? A quirky tidbit emerges when the apprentice tells you about a baker in the next district who once demanded to be paid in dates instead of bread. The arrangement didn't last long, apparently, because the man ended up eating all his salary before the week was out. He's probably still chewing. The younger apprentice giggles. You watch as the head baker divides the freshly baked loaves into piles. One stack will be sold in the market, another reserved for temple offerings, and a smaller pile set aside for the workers' families. This, he says, patting the modest heap, is our dinner and our pay, and if the bread's good, the beer will taste better too. He pours a small clay cup of frothy barley beer and hands it to you. It's warm, tangy, and just sweet enough to cut through the day's exhaustion. The apprentices are already tucking into their wages, gnawing on warm crusts and dipping them into bowls of lentil stew. You join them, sitting on the cool stone floor, and it feels strangely comforting, like sharing a meal with distant ancestors. The baker breaks a loaf in half and hands it to you, saying, "Eat. You worked for it today." You grin, remembering your clumsy attempt at sliding dough into the oven earlier, and decide you've definitely earned at least half a loaf. Outside, the sounds of the city shift into a slower rhythm. Merchants are packing up their stalls, the hum of the marketplace replaced by the creak of wooden carts and the soft footsteps of people heading home. A stray cat wanders into the bakery, sniffing around hopefully for scraps. The younger apprentice tosses it a small piece of bread, and the cat purrs like it's been fed a feast. The conversation drifts to the price of grain. Apparently, a shipment from the north has been delayed, and everyone is worried about shortages. If the barley doesn't arrive, the baker says grimly, we'll have to bake with whatever we can find, maybe ground chickpeas or even lentils. The apprentices pull faces at the idea of lentil bread, but you suspect it's not as bad as they think. After all, necessity often inspires the best recipes. As the night wears on, the baker leans against the oven, his face glowing in the firelight. He talks about the times he's been underpaid, like when he baked 200 loaves for a temple feast and got nothing but praise from the gods in return. Praise, he says with a snort, doesn't fill your stomach. You can't help but laugh at his dry humor, though you secretly admire how he keeps doing this, day after day, because the city needs its bread. The apprentices nod in agreement, though one cheekily adds, I'll take 2 goats for my first payday. The baker chuckles and shakes his head. Dream on, boy, he says, dream on. The night has softened into a quiet, silvery calm by the time the last warm loaf emerges from the oven. The fire, once fierce and bright, now glows like fading embers on a winter hearth. The baker slides the final loaf onto the wooden board with a kind of slow reverence, as if closing the book on another long chapter of work. He exhales deeply, wiping his brow, and for the first time all day, you notice the lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. The apprentices gather close, their faces flushed with the satisfaction of surviving another day in this heat-drenched bakery. This one's for us, the baker says with a tired grin, holding up the final loaf like a small victory trophy. It's nothing fancy, no honey glaze, no sesame crown, just simple, golden brown bread, its crust crackling softly in the cool night air. Historians still argue whether Babylonians ended their day with communal meals or kept to their own homes. Watching this scene, you're inclined to believe the former. There's something deeply communal about tearing bread together at the end of a day's labor. The baker rips the loaf into uneven chunks, passing them around like currency of gratitude. Each bite is warm, earthy, and almost sweet, carrying the story of the day in its flavor. A quirky tidbit emerges when the younger apprentice, mouthful of bread, points out the face of a goat in the loaf's uneven crust. The older one scoffs, but the baker chuckles. "Maybe that's our bonus goat," he says, and the whole group bursts into laughter. You chew your piece slowly, letting the sound of their voices wrap around you like a soft blanket. Outside, Babylon has settled into a hushed rhythm. The moonlight drapes over the city's mud brick walls, turning them a pale shade of silver. Somewhere in the distance, a night watchman hums a tune, and the faint clink of a guard's spear echoes down the empty streets. Even the air feels slower, cooler, as though the city itself has paused to take a breath. The baker leans back against the wall, his eyes half closed. "Tomorrow," he mutters, "we start all over again. Fire, flour, and shadows." You sense a kind of quiet pride in his voice. It's not a glamorous life, but it's one built on rhythm, care, and the simple magic of turning grain into nourishment. You watch as the apprentices curl up on mats near the oven, their laughter fading into drowsy murmurs. The warmth of the clay oven lulls them like a primitive heater, and within moments their eyes close. You sit nearby, feeling your own eyelids grow heavy. The smell of baked bread still lingers, comforting and familiar. The baker glances your way and says softly, "Sleep now. You've earned it." You nod, settling back, letting the sounds of crackling embers and distant night insects carry you into a hazy calm. The bakery fades into the soft quiet of the night, its glow dimming to a gentle, pulsing warmth. You feel your breathing slow as you picture the last crumbs of bread resting on the wooden table, like tiny sparks of effort left behind by tired hands. Every sound grows softer now, the distant hum of the city, the rustle of palm fronds, the gentle crackle of cooling embers. The day's rush has ended, and the silence feels like a sigh of relief that drapes itself over everything. You imagine the bread cooling on its board, steam rising in faint, lazy curls. The moonlight glints off the clay ovens, giving them a soft halo, as though they too are slipping into a deep sleep after a long day of heat and fire. Even the apprentices have stilled, their breath slow, and even their dreams likely filled with rolling dough and glowing firelight. The baker's voice lingers in your mind steady, warm, a quiet echo of all that came before: fire, flour, patience, and care. You let that rhythm carry you now, your own heartbeat syncing with the slow cadence of a world where time is measured not by clocks, but by the rise and fall of the sun, the drip of water, the dance of shadows. Feel your body growing heavier, sinking into the quiet, as if you too are cooling like a finished loaf. Every muscle unwinds, every thought softens, until nothing is left but the gentle hum of the night. You are safe, warm, and wrapped in the ancient calm of Babylonian bread-baking dreams.